The morning light spilled through the towering glass windows of the grand hotel lobby, spreading a golden sheen across every polished surface. The marble floors reflected everything like still water, catching the gleam of expensive shoes and the shimmer of silk and satin, as guests drifted past with the weightless confidence of those accustomed to luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light that danced across the walls, making the columns and arches appear almost regal. Laughter floated between clusters of travelers seated on velvet sofas, and the chime of glassware from the nearby cafe blended with the rhythmic clicks of heels. Bellboys rushed about with gleaming luggage carts, their uniforms crisp and pressed, moving with the silent grace expected in such a place. Into this glittering display stepped two figures who seemed carved from a different world entirely. The older man, with sun-darkened skin and lines etched deep into his face, carried a battered leather suitcase that had clearly survived decades of travel and toil. His coat, though neatly buttoned, showed signs of wear around the cuffs, and the brim of his hat was frayed from years of wind and sun. Beside him, his wife, slight and frail beneath layers of faded fabric, held her own bag close to her chest. Her scarf, once perhaps bright, had dulled with time, and her coat was too thin for the lingering morning chill. They did not rush. Their steps were careful and quiet, as though unsure whether they were truly allowed to place their feet on such a gleaming floor. They stood near the reception desk, the hum of distant conversations pressing in around them, a reminder that they were intruders in a space designed for elegance and wealth. Several guests near the desk glanced at them, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disdain within seconds. A couple seated nearby paused mid-conversation to whisper behind gloved hands. The receptionist, who had been chatting with her colleagues, slowed her smile as she noticed the couple stepping forward. The tapping of keys and rustling of papers behind the desk quieted in subtle, unspoken judgment. No one said anything aloud yet, but the message in their eyes was loud enough. Elias felt it but did not react. He placed the suitcase gently at his feet and took his wife's arm, trying to offer steadiness and silent reassurance. Before either of them could speak, the hotel manager approached the desk with the confident stride of a man who believed every inch of the place answered to him. His suit was tailored to perfection, the silver cufflinks at his wrists glinting under the lights. His hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place, and his expression was one of mild irritation that something so unsightly had drifted into his immaculate sphere. He leaned slightly forward over the desk, crossing his arms as if to block access before they even asked for it. His voice cut through the air, loud enough for the nearest dozen people to hear clearly. "Pay for the cheap room, and leave quickly. People like you don't belong here." The mockery in his tone was sharp, the pride in his smirk unmistakable. A ripple of laughter stirred behind the desk, soft but cruel, the kind of laughter that hides behind lowered eyes and covered mouths. One of the receptionists let out a short giggle before biting her lip, and another glanced away as though pretending not to be part of it. Ruth's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She lowered her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the marble floor as though she wished she could sink through it and disappear. The sting of embarrassment rose in her chest, not for herself alone, but for her husband, who had carried burdens heavier than any of these people would ever know. Her shoulders trembled almost imperceptibly, a tremor born not of cold but of humiliation. She felt the gazes digging into her back, the silent question lingering in the air. Why are they here? But Elias remained still, his posture straight, his eyes steady. There was no anger in his gaze, only a firmness that came from years of endurance. He lifted his head and met the manager's eyes, the silence around them deepening as those nearby sensed something shift. The laughter quieted, replaced by unease and curiosity. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not argue or plead. His presence alone carried a gravity that softened the smirk on the manager's face, if only for a heartbeat. In that stillness, the room seemed to pause, the glimmering chandeliers above casting light on a moment no one had expected to matter. Elias had not always walked beneath chandeliers or across marble floors. Most of his life had been spent beneath open skies, where the horizon stretched wider than any city street, and the earth itself answered to the labor of his hands. He was born on farmland that his father and grandfather had worked before him, a patch of soil that had fed generations with nothing more than sweat, patience, and prayer. Long before his beard turned gray, he had risen before dawn every day, stepping into fields still wet with dew while most of the world slept. His hands had known the weight of plows, the chill of iron tools at first light, and the sting of rope cuts during harvest. He remembered the seasons not by calendar dates but by how the wind smelled, or how the soil felt between his fingertips. Ruth had joined him on that land when they were both young, back when the farmhouse still had fresh paint and the orchard outside their windows bloomed with promise. Her days began in the kitchen, where the aroma of fresh bread mixed with the sounds of roosters and the creak of old wooden floors. She packed meals wrapped in cloth for him when the sun was barely up, and watched him cross the fields with the kind of quiet pride only a wife of a working man understands. Their early years had not been rich in money, but they had known joy in simpler things. The laughter of children running barefoot in tall grass, the rhythm of rain on tin roofs, evenings spent on the porch with lanterns flickering and stories shared in low voices. But time, like weather, does not always show mercy. They lost their eldest son to illness in his 20s, a wound that carved itself into Ruth's heart and never fully healed. The younger two moved to the city in search of work, promising to visit often but finding themselves caught in the machinery of urban life. For years, Elias and Ruth worked the farm alone, holding on not to profit but to memory. Each season brought more challenges. The rain came too late or too early, crops failed without warning, and equipment broke faster than it could be repaired. They sold livestock, then machinery, then acreage, piece by piece, until only a fraction of the land remained. Yet even in those years of stripping down, Elias never lowered his head in defeat. He knew every furrow in the ground like the lines in his palms. When prices dropped and buyers bargained hard, he remained steady. The people who came to purchase his produce, grocers, restaurant owners, and hotel suppliers, admired his reliability. They knew he delivered on time, every time, whether the sun scorched the earth or rain turned the roads to mud. More than once, he had driven to the city himself, arriving before dawn with crates of vegetables, grains, and fruit, unloading them into kitchens that would never know his name. Ruth supported him through those years with a strength few noticed unless they looked closely. Even as her hair thinned and her joints stiffened, she woke each day with quiet determination. She mended his shirts by lamplight, saved what little they earned, and stretched every coin to cover what needed covering. When she fell ill and the doctor in town told her she needed treatment that could not be done locally, Elias sold the last of the farm without hesitation. The house where they had lived for decades, the barn he had repaired 100 times the fields where their children had played. He let them go because her life meant more than land or legacy. They traveled by bus to the city with nothing but 2 suitcases and a small amount of money, enough for meals, travel, and a night of shelter while they awaited her appointment at the hospital. They did not choose the Grand Hotel out of vanity or foolishness. It was simply the closest place near the clinic that had rooms available on such short notice. They had called ahead and been told there was a low-cost room for single-night stay. They carried no expectations of courtesy, only the hope of rest. Yet as they stepped into the lobby, the past fell away beneath the weight of present judgment. The lines on Elias's face were mistaken for weakness rather than wisdom. Ruth's silence was seen as insignificance rather than grace. To the staff behind the counter and to the guests standing nearby, they were not a man and woman who had spent their lives putting food on tables in this very city. They were reduced to the condition of their clothes, the weathering of their skin, the wear of their belongings. The years of service, sacrifice, and resilience vanished in the glare of superficial assumptions. But standing there among polished shoes and tailored suits, Elias carried within him the quiet certainty of someone who had weathered more than ridicule. The city might not recognize him, but the earth did, and so did the countless people who once ate the harvests he brought forth. The humiliation in that moment cut deep, but it did not unmake him. He did not shrink beneath their stares because his worth had never been measured by their standards. The life he had lived, the love he shared with his wife, and the dignity he preserved through every hardship were not things that could be erased by a sneer or a careless laugh. The laughter in the lobby had not lasted long, but the sting of it hung in the air even after the sound faded. The manager stood with his chin lifted slightly, as though he believed his words were not only justified, but expected in a place such as this. The reception staff shifted behind him, some pretending to type, others stealing glances at Elias and Ruth with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. A pair of guests near the sofa area paused their conversation just to watch. The moment had become a spectacle, as though humanity paused briefly to decide whether to look away or lean in further. Ruth's fingers trembled where they clutched her worn bag, and for a second she looked as though she might turn and walk out to spare herself the deepening shame. But Elias's hand came to rest gently over hers, steady and firm, and though he did not speak to her, the touch carried a silent promise that they would not leave bowed. Slowly he lifted his gaze and met the eyes of the man who had mocked them. He did not glare, nor did he flinch. His expression was calm, and his voice when it came was low, even, and edged with a gravity that turned ears in his direction. He began by addressing the man not with accusation, but with a word that landed with unexpected weight. Son. That single word, spoken without anger, startled the manager more than a shout could have. It stripped away the pretense of superiority, speaking from a place of age, labor, and quiet pride. I came here not to beg for what I cannot pay. The room seemed to still around him as he spoke, his voice threading through the silence like something ancient and steady. I came here to rest after giving more than 50 years of my life to feed people like you. There was no grandeur in the way he said it, only truth. His fingers brushed the handle of his suitcase and he nodded to it with meaning. This suitcase you mock held my tools, the same tools that tilled the earth, so the children in this city would not go hungry. The words were simple, but they settled into the air with a weight few could ignore. Conversations nearby quieted to silence, and even those who had turned away moments earlier found themselves glancing back, suddenly unsure. A young bellboy stopped mid-step, his eyes widening as he watched from a distance. A woman seated on a chaise near the elevator straightened, her mocking smirk replaced by surprise. The receptionist who had giggled earlier lowered her eyes. The laughter that had cut through Ruth like a blade was gone, replaced by a hush that revealed the discomfort and unease of those who had taken part in judgment. Elias did not raise his voice, yet every syllable carried farther than the manager's arrogant tone had moments before. He drew a slow breath, not with the rush of someone arguing, but with the conviction of a man who had lived through too much to be silenced now. I may wear worn clothes, but each wrinkle on this shirt was earned with honest work. Each scar on my hands is a story of survival. And if paying for the cheap room is the only way you see me, then remember this. Cheap doesn't mean worthless. I have lived a life richer than these walls could ever contain. His words were neither polished nor poetic, yet they struck with the force of something deeply real. Across the lobby, eyes shifted, and the invisible lines dividing those who belonged and those who did not began to blur. A woman in a blue blazer behind the desk bit her lip and stood a little straighter, the discomfort etched into her face. A middle-aged businessman who had been watching with folded arms glanced toward the marble floor, unable to maintain the same certainty he had worn moments before. The silence stretched long enough for the weight of his statement to truly settle in the minds of those who stood witness. Ruth, still holding tightly to his arm, looked up at Elias, the tears no longer born of humiliation, but of pride she did not attempt to hide. Her eyes reflected the strength in his voice, and the tremor in her shoulders eased. She whispered his name softly, a plea that carried both fear and admiration, but he shook his head gently, not to silence her, but to reassure her. His gaze did not leave the manager's face. People like us have been silenced too many times. Today, they will hear. The manager's composure shifted in subtle cracks. The smugness that had once lifted his lips had faltered, replaced with the tightness of someone realizing the room was no longer on his side. He cleared his throat, but the sound lacked its previous sharpness. Well, rules are rules, he said, but even he seemed to hear the uncertainty behind his own words. He stepped back a half inch, then back again, as if distance might somehow restore the authority slipping from his grip. It was then that Elias bent slowly, unlatched the worn suitcase, and lifted from it an object many in the room would not have expected. An old leather-bound ledger, edges scuffed and pages thick with years of ink and fingerprints. He set it on the desk with more force than his age suggested possible, the thud startling the moment into sharper focus. The sound echoed across the marble floors, and even those pretending not to look could no longer feign disinterest. Inside were records that spoke louder than any defense he could give. Receipts, signatures, delivery logs, and notes from vendors and kitchens, evidence of decades of work that had sustained the very establishments that now looked upon him with disdain. His hands rested on the ledger as though it were both shield and testimony. For years, my farm supplied the food that filled your banquets. These fruits, these grains, these vegetables, you served them to wealthy guests under chandeliers like these. And now you mock the very hands that fed you. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples through every watching face. The staff exchanged looks, some with guilt, others with discomfort sharp enough to bow their heads. Guests shifted uneasily, the shame of their snickering coming back to them with harsh clarity. No one laughed now. The marble, the lights, the tailored suits, none of it seemed as grand as it had a moment before. Elias did not ask for pity. He did not need it. He had simply reminded them, with the calm strength of truth, that dignity is not a luxury afforded by wealth, but a right carried in the soul of anyone who has ever built their life with their own hands. For a moment, no one moved. The ledger lay open on the polished counter like a mirror held up to the conscience of the room. The pages, yellowed at the edges and worn smooth by time and use, revealed rows of dates and deliveries, names of businesses and hotels, and signatures from people who had once depended on the man now being mocked for the state of his clothes. The truth did not shout. It simply stood there, undeniable and patient, and those who had laughed found their voices gone. A hush spread across the lobby, thick and weighty. The receptionist who had giggled pressed her lips together, her eyes darting down to the floor. The man who had whispered to his companion near the sofa shifted in his seat, his confidence shrinking into silence. A young couple who had paused to watch turned their faces away, shame flickering in their eyes. Even the bellboy, too young to know the full story but old enough to feel the discomfort of what had happened, stood still with his cart, staring at the floor as if he wished he could undo the moment. The manager's breath caught in his throat, though he tried not to show it. The color drained slightly from his face, replaced with a stiffness around the eyes that betrayed the crack in his composure. His voice, once sharp and arrogant, was quieter now as he attempted to recover control. His hands, which had rested confidently on the counter a moment ago, now hovered awkwardly at his sides. He looked at the ledger, then at Elias, then at the faces of the guests who were no longer amused by his performance. In the stillness, an older woman seated in a high-backed chair near the windows rose slowly to her feet. Her hair was white and pinned neatly, her coat elegant without excess. She clapped once, gently, almost as if testing whether the world would allow such a response. Then she clapped again, firmer this time. The sound broke the silence like a drop of water on glass. All eyes turned to her. She nodded in Elias's direction, respect softening the lines of her face. Another guest, a man in a dark blazer standing near the bar area, lifted his hands and joined in. The applause was hesitant at first, scattered like raindrops before a storm, but it grew with each passing second as others found their courage. Hands met hands. Heads bowed. The sound spread across the marble floor until the echo of shame was drowned out. The manager's shoulders lowered, though whether in defeat or humility was not yet clear. His lips parted, then closed again as he struggled for words. When he finally spoke, there was no trace of mockery left. "Sir, I apologize. Please take the suite. No charge." His voice shook on the last word, not with anger but with the weight of pride swallowed too late. He looked around for support among the staff, but none stepped forward to back him. The receptionist who had laughed earlier now stood rigid, unable to meet Elias's gaze. Elias did not smile, nor did he gloat in his quiet victory. He simply lifted his hand and closed the leather-bound ledger with care, as though it were something sacred. "We did not come here for charity. We only ask for what we can pay for, nothing more, nothing less." His refusal struck deeper than anger ever could. It was a reminder that the respect he sought was not a gift to be granted, but a dignity that had always belonged to him. Ruth stood beside him, her hand still looped through his arm. The tears in her eyes were no longer from humiliation, but from a tender pride that swelled beneath her ribs. Her heart, worn from years of endurance, beat a little stronger in that moment. She looked at the faces around them and saw not judgment now, but quiet understanding, or at least the beginning of it. The manager swallowed hard, nodding slowly as he signaled to the receptionist. A room key was fetched immediately, no hesitation, no further comments. Ruth accepted it with a soft thank you, her voice steady where it had once trembled. As they turned to walk toward the elevators, the applause had faded into a reverent silence. No one reached out to stop them, but more than one pair of eyes followed them with a sense of humility rarely seen in such a place. The chandeliers still glowed overhead. The marble still shone beneath their feet. Yet the atmosphere in the lobby had shifted, reshaped not by wealth or command, but by truth spoken without fear. Some guests looked humbled, others thoughtful. A few appeared ashamed of the laughter they had shared. The young bellboy stood tall again, his eyes following Elias with a newfound respect. Ruth and Elias walked quietly, side by side, their steps slow but certain. The world had tried to shrink them into something small, something to be dismissed or pitied. But in speaking with the honesty of a life earned through labor and love, they had risen above the whispers and the stares. Their dignity remained intact, untouched by polished floors or cold glances. At the elevator, Ruth laid her hand over Elias's. Her voice was barely above a breath. "You spoke for more than just us." He glanced at her gently, his expression calm. "Sometimes," he said, "the world forgets who feeds it." She nodded, and the doors opened with a soft chime. As they stepped inside, the lobby behind them remained quiet, no longer the stage of mockery but of memory. The sound of applause, the sting of truth, and the silent lessons left in the wake of their footsteps would linger long after the elevator doors closed.